All right. So this is a brief lecture on motivation and work. So today we're going to talk about motivation. We're going to talk about a few different theories of motivation. We'll talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and then we'll address three specific areas of human motivation: hunger, sexual motivation, and motivation to work. So I like to start by asking just some general thought questions. Why would someone gamble away $600 in less than 15 minutes? Why did you come to class today? Or why are you watching this video right now? Why do some people eat excessively and other people not enough? Why do people need social and sexual relationships with others? And all of these questions are questions of motivation, right? Motivation are internal processes that cause us to begin and sustain some kind of behavior towards some kind of goal, some kind of end. So you can think of, being hungry. If you're sitting at home right now and you're hungry, you might pause this video, get up, go to the refrigerator. Maybe if you don't have food in the fridge, you might go down the street to the store or to a local restaurant. Right? But the idea here is that this motivated behavior can start with a physiological deficiency. Right? Your body physically needs food. Right? Food is the fuel on which your body runs, food and water. So we have these physiological needs that they're deficiencies within our body that create these drives. There's these physiological or psychological expressions of some unmet need, right? So we know that this feeling that we have, our body creates a feeling, and we know that feeling to mean I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I need to use the bathroom, right? So these physiological needs create these psychological drives. So one theory of motivation is drive reduction theory. And this states that this physiological need creates this aroused state that drives the organism to reduce the need, right? So you have this experience, you interpret that as a need for food or water. This creates this psychological expression of hunger and thirst. And then you go and you engage in a behavior to reduce that need, right? So reduce that drive, right? Satisfy the need by reducing the drive. So the idea here is that needs push you towards certain behaviors, but sometimes all of our needs might be met, but we still engage in a behavior. So in other words, drive reduction theory isn't the only game in town. But there are a lot of things that people do that aren't satisfying physiological needs. So the question is, why do we do those things? For example, let's say you're super full, right? You went downtown Chicago, you ate at the Grand Lux Cafe. If you're familiar with that restaurant, they literally serve you mounds of food. So you're super full, but your roommate comes home with some cherry pie, and you love cherry pie, right? So you eat a giant slice. Now the question is, why do you eat that slice of pie, right? Clearly, your needs are satisfied. Your um, drive to eat should be satisfied by the fact that you are full, but yet you still eat the pie, right? So the reason you do is because of incentives, right? So there are some stimuli in our environment that don't necessarily satisfy some kind of physiological need, but they have a positive or negative pull attached to them. So, if needs push you towards some kind of behavior, incentives pull you towards some kind of behavior, right? So your needs pushed you to go out to get dinner, and you ate that dinner. But you ate the cherry pie because of the incentive value that that cherry pie has for you. You love cherry pie, it's delicious. Maybe you think that if you don't eat that slice now, your roommate's going to eat it tonight and it's going to be gone, right? But there's some kind of pull, there's some kind of reason, there's something about that particular stimuli that pulls you towards it, right? And this has value beyond needs. But this can also be based on experience, right? So maybe your roommate comes home with, Jimmy Dean pancakes, chocolate chip pancake sausage on a stick, right? And you think that that's disgusting. So you decide not to eat it, right? You're super full. You're like, that's disgusting. I'm not going to eat that, right? So this negative incentive or disincentive to eat this food. Now, interestingly, right, these disincentives can play against our physiological needs, right? So if you are hungry and all you have in your house to eat is Jimmy Dean pancakes, chocolate chip pancake sausage on a stick, right? You might decide not to eat that food, even though you're hungry and eating it would satisfy that physiological need for food. There's a negative incentive, right? You don't like it. Maybe it has too many calories. Maybe you're just not a fan of sausage and chocolate chips together, whatever that is, but it has a negative incentive, so you don't eat it. So we have these two theories now. We've got drive reduction theory, right? We're motivated to engage in behaviors to reduce, to satisfy psychological drives that are based in part on these physiological needs, but we're also motivated by incentives, the positive or negative pull of particular environmental stimuli. Now, drive reduction theory is primarily about these biological needs and homeostasis, right? So maintaining our body. But oftentimes we do things that have no survival value, right? So for example, in the early 80s, a guy did a tightrope walk between the Twin Towers in New York City, right? Clearly this has no survival value. So what motivates this kind of behavior? One theory is what we call arousal theory. And we talked about arousal, generally speaking, back when we talked about physiological psychology. But arousal theory generally states that we have this sort of baseline level of alertness and arousal, right? So you wake up in the morning, you're a little groggy, you have low levels of arousal. By the time you get going in your day, you've sort of woken up and you have a general level of arousal, right? If you're out playing basketball in the afternoon, right, maybe your arousal is a little bit higher than it was when you're just sort of working in the morning. But the idea is we have this sort of general level of arousal. And whenever our level of arousal drops below a certain threshold, we seek ways to increase that arousal, right? So the idea here is that, if you are bored, let's say you're working at work and you're doing some really menial data entry, boring task, you might seek ways to increase your arousal by distracting yourself from that, by going onto Facebook or by, looking at things on the internet, right? So the idea here is that we're always looking for an optimum level of arousal at any given moment, right? We don't want to be too bored, but we also don't want to be overstimulated as well, right? So one reason why people do things is to seek this optimum level of arousal. Now, this optimum level might be different for different people. So this person on the tightrope here clearly has probably a higher level of optimum arousal, right? People who are stuntmen, the Red Bull guy who jumped out of the space capsule and did a free fall to Earth for 20,000 feet, right? These people probably have a higher threshold than a person who might be completely satisfied to kind of sit on the couch and play video games. But the idea is we look for this optimum arousal, and whenever our arousal drops below that optimum level, we seek ways to increase that. Now, so we talked about this idea of having needs. We talked about 3 different theories of motivation. And Abraham Maslow came along in the 1970s, and he imposed a hierarchy on our needs that we have. And what he suggests is that some needs have higher priorities than others. So physiological needs like breathing, hunger, and thirst come before psychological needs like achievement, self-esteem, and recognition. So he put together this pyramid, this hierarchy of needs. At the bottom are physiological needs. These are things like eating, drinking, elimination. People might also argue sex comes under a physiological need. Then we have safety needs, right? So we, desire to have a world that's safe. We need to have shelter. We need to feel like our world is predictable. We're secure. And then above that, we have belongingness needs. So this is our desire to feel connected, to avoid rejection, to avoid loneliness. Again, based on our sort of individual needs, right? Some people might seek more social connection than others, right? But generally we have a need to belong. Then above that we have esteem needs, right? So this is, now we've got this, we feel sort of secure in our group, we feel like we belong and we're accepted. Now we want recognition and respect. We want status. We want to feel like we're achieving our goals. We want to feel like we're being recognized for those achievements. And at the very top of this pyramid is self-actualization. So this is the need to live up to one's fullest and unique potential, right? If you, fulfilling your purpose in life, if you will. Now, this is sort of the organization of our needs. And what Maslow argues is that lower order needs must be satisfied before we can pursue higher order needs. So the idea here is that if you are, let's say, for example, that doing well in this class satisfies esteem needs, right? This satisfies a sense of achievement, of satisfying goals. But let's say you get a notice in the mail that for whatever reason, your landlord stopped paying the mortgage on your apartment building and you are going to be evicted, right? So what this means is that your safety needs are now threatened, right? You need to have a place to live. So what Maslow would argue is in that situation, you are going to prioritize your safety needs over your esteem needs, right? It's not important to you to do well on this week's homework assignment if you have no place to live, right? So you have to focus on finding a place to live before you can address your higher order need of achievement, right? So the idea that Maslow puts forward is that lower order needs must be satisfied before higher order needs. But this is not always true, so people can prioritize their needs. And sometimes behaviors can address needs at multiple levels. So if you imagine imagine an Iraq War veteran who, um, imagine an Iraq war veteran who signs up for multiple deployments, right? Going and being in a war zone is antithetical to safety, right? You're putting yourself in harm's way. But that soldier, that person might sign up for multiple deployments because they feel like, this is their purpose in life, or because they feel like they're getting respect and recognition from their peers, or they can advance their military career this way. Or it could be for belongingness. They feel motivated they feel motivated to maintain connections with their particular regiment or platoon or whatever. But so the idea here is that this soldier can prioritize these esteem and belonging needs and sacrifice safety needs towards those higher order needs. So that was drive reduction. So that was our theories of motivation um, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're going to talk briefly about three different aspects: hunger, sex, and work. So hunger and thirst are some of our most basic physiological needs, right? Maslow puts these at the bottom of the pyramid, right? Because if you are starving, nothing else matters than getting food. If you haven't had water in several days, nothing else matters. Water and food are sort of the fuel that run our bodies. If you imagine your body is like a car, the car needs gasoline to run. Our bodies need food and water to run. Generally speaking, in 70-degree weather, you'd last only 10 days with no water. And as it gets hotter, survival goes down. So at 90 degrees, you're looking at maybe 3 days, 2 days without water. All else being equal, you could live up to about 4 to 6 weeks without food, again, depending on your fat reserves, right? So obese people are going to be able to live a little bit longer without food than people who are not obese because they just have greater amounts of energy reserves. The physiology of hunger. So one question that we can ask about hunger is, what is the source of hunger? Where does it come from? Cannon and Washburn, early in the century, thought that perhaps the source of hunger might be the stomach. So Washburn swallows a balloon to try and measure this. And the balloon is inflated against the walls of his stomach. And every time his stomach contracts, they can measure those contractions with this balloon device. And then when he feels hungry, he pushes a button. And what they find is that there's a correlation, there's a relationship between feeling hungry and these stomach contractions. So Cannon and Washburn argue that the stomach might be the source of our experience of hunger, right? So the stomach is what is making us hungry. Sang in 1938 came along and said, okay, well, if the stomach is the source of hunger, then let's remove the stomachs of rats. And if we remove the stomach, then perhaps they wouldn't feel hungry, right? If the stomach is why we feel hungry, if you remove the stomach, then these rats shouldn't feel hungry. Yet, when they removed the stomachs of these rats, they still felt hungry. They still ate food, right? Essentially, what they did is they removed the stomach and just connected the esophagus directly to the small intestine. Um, so what Fincham what Sang concluded was that the um, the stomach can't be the only source of hunger, right? It might be one part of this process, but there have to be other things going on, right? Since then, we've learned that our body, our hypothalamus, is monitoring the amount of blood glucose in our system, right? And our body is trying to maintain sort of a relatively constant level of blood glucose in our system, right? Blood glucose, essentially blood sugar, is the gasoline that runs our body, if you will, right? All of our food gets converted into blood sugar that then our cells in our body can metabolize and use for basic life support. When that level of blood sugar drops, the hypothalamus detects these changes and releases hormones that result in our perception of hunger, right? Our experience of hunger. The hypothalamus, you can think of this in terms of the drive reduction theory. The hypothalamus is what is sort of initiating this physiological need. It monitors this physiological deficiency, initiates this release of hormone, which results in our drive, which results in our perception of hunger. So there's different parts of the hypothalamus, and this related to the homework assignment for this week, or this relates to the homework assignment for this week. So the lateral hypothalamus is just sort of the sides of the hypothalamus. Increases hunger by releasing orexin, a particular hormone called orexin. So if you lesion a rat's lateral hypothalamus, if you destroy it, what you find is that the rat is completely indifferent to food, even when they're starving. Eventually, they will start to eat, but they will be indifferent to food for quite a period of time until they go into sort of starvation mode, and they'll eat a little bit more, right? But it sort of adjusts their level of eating. The ventromedial hypothalamus depresses hunger. So once you are full, you've eaten enough. The ventromedial hypothalamus releases another series of hormones, and these hormones stop the eating process, right? So the idea here is that if you lesion the rat's ventromedial hypothalamus, the animal will eat excessively, right? So this poor little fat rat over here just eats and eats and eats because he doesn't get signals from his brain telling them he's full. So for the assignment for this week, you're going to work with a little web applet where you will actually physically be able to stimulate and destroy rats' lateral and ventromedial hypothalami, and you'll be able to observe the resulting changes in the rat's feeding and weight gain. Okay. So make sure you take a look at that. One theory on weight and weight gain is this idea of settling point theory, set point or settling point theory. And the idea here is that our body is always trying to strike a balance between the amount of energy we expend and the amount of energy that we consume, right? So if you think about your body in like a car, right? If you're driving on the highway, you're using a lot of energy, and so your body is, essentially trying to so using this car metaphor, your body is trying to keep the gas tank at the same level all the time. So if you're on the highway and you're expending a lot of energy, then your body wants you to consume more energy. So if you're on the highway expending a lot of energy, then your body, the car, wants you to put more energy into the gas tank, right? Because it wants to maintain this sort of balance between the amount of energy you expend, you use up during the day, and the amount of calories you consume. Right? So we're trying to maintain this sort of set point weight. And it's important to note that the set point weight is just whatever weight you happen to be right now. Right? And so we do this by increasing hunger and reducing energy consumption when we haven't eaten enough. Right? So if you go out and you're at the pool all day and you've been swimming, if you've ever had that experience, you'll find that you expend a lot of energy swimming around and then you're really, really hungry. Right? Your body wants to maintain your sort of current weight, so it makes you hungry in order to balance out the amount of calories you've expended, right? Also, this is part of the reason why dieting is problematic, because when you haven't eaten in a while, right, so you're restricting your energy intake, your body actually reduces energy consumption to try and maintain your current set point. Effectively, your body slows down the amount of energy it burns, just sort of sitting still, in order to sort of conserve that energy. Right. Our body will also increase energy consumption and decrease hunger if we've eaten too much. But it can only increase consumption to a point if we're not active in and of ourselves. Um, the idea behind this settling point theory is this idea of the basal metabolic rate. So if you think of your body as a car, right? If the engine in your car is running, it's consuming fuel, right? And our body is much the same way. Even sitting still, we are consuming energy. We are burning calories just to sit still. And our basal metabolic rate is sort of the amount of energy we consume while we are resting, right? If you think about this as in the car metaphor, right, this is the amount of gas it takes to run the engine at idle. Okay. Now, when you expend a lot of energy, you're swimming at the pool, you're playing basketball, you increase the amount of energy you're consuming, and likewise, when you're sort of resting, you go back to this basal metabolic rate, sort of your resting energy consumption. Now, not everyone's basal metabolic rate is the same, right? The amount of energy that your body consumes when you are resting depends in large part on the amount of muscle mass that you have, right? So again, back to the car metaphor, a little, little tiny Honda Civic doesn't consume as much gas at idle as, a giant, Ford, diesel truck, right? In the same way, someone who's got tons of muscle mass, a football player, their bodies consume more energy throughout the day because it requires a lot of energy to maintain that muscle mass. So this basal metabolic rate plays a role in terms of the amount of energy that our body consumes. So briefly talk about obesity and weight loss. So a lot of people like to think about obesity sort of in simplistic terms, that there's this balance between the amount of energy you consume and the amount of energy that you intake, right? The amount of calories you consume versus the amount of energy your body expends. And if you balance towards calorie consumption, so if you consume more calories than you burn in a day, and over time that leads to weight gain. And that is in part true, but it also is a little bit more complicated. It has to do with the kinds of foods that you eat. So I have a couple links here. You can take a look at these studies, but highly processed foods lend themselves to greater weight gain than non-highly processed foods. So in this study, they overfed rats by X number of calories, and half of the rats got a high calorie overfed on high fructose corn syrup and processed calories, and the other half got overfed on their sort of standard rat chow, whole grains, nuts kind of calories. And they found that the high fructose corn syrup rats gained weight at a faster rate than those who were overfed on relatively whole foods instead of processed foods. This also results in changes to the human gut flora, right? So in this study, they fed one group of rats high fructose corn syrup, high sugar, high fat, sort of the Western McDonald's diet. The other group they fed primarily the same amount of calories, but they fed them a balanced diet of sort of fruits and vegetables and that sort of thing. And what they found was that when they overfed them, both rats gained the same amount of weight, but the rats that were on the high-fat, high-sugar diet actually had a harder time losing the weight once they restricted the calories back to a normal level. And the reason for this was the bacteriological cultures in their intestines actually changed because of the high-fat, high-sugar diet. Right. So the take home here is it's not just how much you eat, but it's also the kind of food that you eat. Not all calories are created equal, right? Essentially, that if you eat 1,000 calories of fruits and vegetables, that is not as bad for you as eating 1,000 calories of 1,000 calories of high fat, high sugar, in terms of relative weight gain. So the idea here is that as you gain weight, you gradually increase your set point, right? So if you are consistently over-consuming, eating more than you are expending in a day, you will gain weight. the number and size of your fat cells increase, and actually fat cells require less energy to maintain than do muscle cells. And so as you increase your set point, as you increase your weight, your basal metabolic rate actually goes down, right? So the amount of calories you consume when you are just sitting still actually gets lower, right? So the point here is that reducing caloric intake may not be enough. So there are a couple successful weight loss strategies. So obviously, increasing your physical activity, increasing the amount of calories that you burn in a day is helpful for losing weight. Increasing metabolism, building muscle mass can help. Reducing consumption. But there's a trick to reducing consumption. You don't want to crash diet because you don't want your body to go into starvation mode, right? The real trick is to eat smaller portions more often, right? Don't let your body think you're starving, but also don't, overconsume. Don't eat until you feel full and then tired um, and then reduce your physical activity. Think about what you eat. So there's a funny study where they did what they call the iPhone diet, where they had half of the people did sort of a regular diet, the other half just did the iPhone diet. And what the iPhone diet was they just said, take a picture of what you're going to eat. And what they found, so right before you eat something, just take a picture of it. That's it. And what they found was that people on the iPhone diet lost as much weight as people on the regular diet, in part because taking a picture of what you eat, taking a picture of what you eat makes you think about what you are eating, right? If you're walking through the office and someone's got a box of donut holes, right, maybe you might impulsively eat a donut hole, but if you have to take a picture of it, you might think about, do I really want to eat this? That kind of thing. And it might help you to sort of manage your calorie consumption. Um, Also, eat healthy most of the time, right? So try and eat healthy most of the time. Read labels, avoid foods that have partially hydrogenated oil. This is associated with increases in blood pressure and increases in cholesterol levels. Also, try and eat whole foods. And by whole foods, I don't mean the store whole foods, but I mean foods that are minimally processed. So things like fruits and vegetables, foods that foods that don't have minimal amounts of preservatives, these sorts of things. Right? So these are all successful weight loss strategies. All right, so briefly we'll talk about sexual motivation. So from an evolutionary perspective, so generally speaking, people have a universal need for affiliation, right? We want to form and maintain social connections with other people, right? We have this drive to maintain these social connections. And from an evolutionary perspective, sex is all about procreation. It's all about sexual pleasure. The function of sexual pleasure is just for us to pass our genes, our genetics on to the next generation. But more and more evidence suggests that sexual motivation is as much about social bonding as it is about procreation. If you add up on one side the amount of babies that people have, and you add up on the other side the amount of sex that people have, right? People have way, way, way more sex than they have babies, right? So this evidence, this argument suggests that perhaps sexual motivation isn't as much about procreation as it is about social bonding and maintaining social connections. Right? The history of sexual research starts primarily with Alfred Kinsey back in the 1950s. He was trying to accumulate a body about sex. He was trying to accumulate a body of research of facts about sex and sexual behavior. Again, he's operating back in the 1950s, 1940s. This is when, everyone is having lots of sex, but no one is talking about it. And he released these reports. He interviewed thousands of people, released these reports, and discovered pretty shocking things about human sexual behavior. If you look at the lecture notes on this slide, you'll see some pretty stark statistics about the kinds of sexual behavior, the variety of sexual behavior that people were engaging in back in the 1950s. Okay, so it's pretty shocking for its time. So there's this wide variety of sexual behavior. Now, sexual desire is a result primarily of hormones, and it has to do with the hormone of testosterone, both in males and females. Um, so women's testosterone levels fluctuate, but generally peak around ovulation. Ovulation is when, if you're not familiar, ovulation is when the ovaries release an egg, and this is the time when a woman is most fertile, right? So it makes sense that they have the greatest amount of sexual desire when they are the most fertile, again, towards an evolutionary argument. Men's testosterone levels remain relatively constant. Again, this also makes sense from sort of our anecdotal experience of male sexual desire. Um, and unusually low levels of testosterone are associated with lower sexual desire. So we know that testosterone plays a role in sexual desire, but socialization also plays a role in sexual desire. Um, how people learn how to interpret and express their sexual desires from culture, from their parents, from their religious affiliations, and these sorts of things. Okay, so um, our sexual desire is in part based on our biology, but it's also based on socialization. So we talk about the sexual response cycle. So the first phase of sexual response cycle is the excitement phase. This is sexual arousal. So blood engorges both male and female genitalia. That should say male. And it's essentially the body prepares for intercourse. There's a plateau phase where the intercourse actually occurs, or whatever sexual behaviors people are engaging in. Um, and these are associated with increases in blood pressure and heart rate, right? Sex, or again, whatever you're into, involves some amount of physical activity. And so we have these sorts of so correlates of physical activity. Then there's the orgasm phase. This is includes muscle contractions, reinforcing neurotransmitters, right? This is when we have those experiences of pleasure, right? This is what sort of reinforces us to engage in sexual relations again. And then you have the resolution phase. And this is sort of the end of the sexual response cycle, returning back to a non-aroused state. For males, this involves a refractory period, when a period of time in which they're unable to get aroused again. So depends on the males. This can be several minutes up to an hour, but some amount of time before they can become aroused again. So this is a pretty good chart that sort of illustrates all of the factors that go into sexual motivation, from biological, psychological, to social cultural. Now, briefly talk about sexual orientation. We talked about sexual orientation as a preference for emotional and sexual relationships with individuals of the same sex, different sex and or either sex. This is the distinction that we make here is that this is different than same-sex contact. So a person could have same-sex contact, could have a sexual encounter with someone of the same sex, but still identify as potentially straight or heterosexual. So you can think of men who are incarcerated for long periods of time. They may incarcerated in prisons for long periods of time. They may engage in sexual behavior with other males in prison, but once they're released from prison, they desire to maintain sexual relationships with women. They do not necessarily identify themselves as homosexual. So the point here is that there's a distinction between same-sex contact and sexual orientation, in that sexual orientation is about what the individual prefers and how the individual identifies. When we talk about homosexuality, there are some theories of homosexuality that suggest that homosexuality is a result of socialization, right? Either too much same-gendered play as a child, or not enough, a smothering mother, or these other kinds of external accounts for the causes of homosexuality. But it turns out that most of those are not supported. There's increasing evidence that same-sex preference has biological foundations. So for example, if they look at twin studies, right? So twin studies, they look at monozygotic twins. These are identical twins. These are twins who, in utero, the egg and the fertilized egg split in half, so they're essentially identical genetically. And what they find is that for monozygotic twins, there's a 52% chance that if your twin is homosexual, then you will also identify as homosexual, right? And this is pretty strong. You compare this to dizygotic twins. So these are twins who came from two separate eggs, but were born at the same time and raised in the same family. There's only a 22% chance of those twins both being homosexual, right? So if you have a dizygotic twin, a fraternal twin who's identifies as homosexual, there's only a 22% chance. And then this is 5% if you compare non-related or adopted brothers, right? So a concordance rate of 52% indicates a pretty strong genetic underpinning to male homosexuality. All right, so that's homosexuality. Now we're going to talk about work. When we talk about work, when we think about work, we think about sort of achieving some goal, not necessarily just paid employment, right? So anything that we do is work, right? If you're working in the yard, you're trying to clean up your backyard because it's springtime, right? That still counts as work. It's not just what you do at your job. What motivates people to work on some level is a need for achievement, right? So whatever your personal standards of success and excellence are, you are motivated to meet those. And the need for achievement focuses on these particular goals as opposed to these sort of inner drives, right? So the goals that we have depend in part, our accomplishment of these goals depends in part on the reasons why we set these goals in the first place. Right? So our motivation to achieve some particular goal depends in large part on why we have that goal in the first place, right? So we can talk about how we frame the goals. So we're more likely to achieve goals. We're going to be more motivated to achieve goals that are specific and achievable. And these are things that are framed in terms of approach rather than avoidance, right? So if I give you a series of questions for a homework assignment, you're going to be more motivated to complete that homework assignment if the questions are specific, if you feel like you can answer them, and if you desire to do well in this class, if your goal is to do well, right? So that's specific, achievable, and approach. As opposed to avoidance, if your goal is to just not get an F in this class, right, then you might be less motivated to exert some effort on that homework assignment, right? So the idea behind this is that approach is when we have desired outcomes or experiences, right? When our motivation is based on achieving something because of something that we want. We want to get an A, we want to do well in class, we want to go to graduate school, we want we want to impress our boss at work, for example. Versus avoidance goals, which is just avoiding that we want to avoid punishment, we want to avoid getting an F, we want to avoid other people looking down upon us or something like that. Right? So generally speaking, you're going to be more motivated when you frame these goals in terms of approach as opposed to avoidance. Also, your expectations play a role in goal achievement. Right? So if you believe that you can succeed in achieving a goal, then you will work harder to achieve that goal. So there's an interesting study. Feather in 1966, they gave people a series of puzzles and they were ranked in terms of difficulty from 1 to 10, 1 being the easiest, 10 being the most difficult, nearly impossible. And what they did was they gave half of the people the puzzles in order from easiest to most difficult. The other half they gave in order from most difficult to easiest. Right, so half of these people came in, they did an easy puzzle, they're like, oh, this is pretty good, I could do this, and then they did another easy puzzle and it got harder and harder. And then for the other group that got the more difficult puzzles first, right, they got that one puzzle, it was really, really tough, and they most likely didn't solve it. Right, now, at the end of this first part of this study, they asked participants, would you like to work on another puzzle after this? And what they found was that the people who got the easy puzzles first were much more willing to work on another puzzle and worked harder on that other puzzle than the people who got the hard puzzles first. They were much less likely to want to continue working on another puzzle. Now, why is this? Well, it's this idea of expectations. Right? So the people who got the easy puzzles first expected that they would do well, right? They did well on the first puzzle, so they thought that they could do well on these puzzles, and so they worked harder. The people who got the hard puzzles first learned that they can't do well, so they didn't think that they could, do well on another puzzle, and so they didn't work as hard. And this idea is what we call self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you believe that you can't do something, right? If you believe that you won't be able to do something, then you will act in ways that bring about that goal or that belief, right? Self-fulfilling prophecy says when you have an expectation, that expectation will become true because you will behave in ways that bring it about, right? So if you believe that you can't learn statistics, right, then maybe you won't come to class. Maybe you won't try as hard on your homework assignment. And you will ultimately not do well in statistics. But if you believe that you can learn statistics, so if I say, I give you some easy statistics questions first, and you do them and you realize, hey, this isn't so hard, and you believe that you can do something, you will work harder. You will study a little bit more. You will come to every class. You will ask a couple more questions, right? So these self-fulfilling prophecies are really powerful, right? If you believe that you can do something, you will bring about that goal. You will work harder to achieve that goal, right? So these expectations are really powerful. One interesting thing is that these expectations are not necessarily based on ourselves. The expectations that other people have for us can also be powerful. So if your significant other tells you, you know what, you're really smart and you are totally going to ace that statistics class, right? Their expectations of you can also influence how hard you work to achieve that goal. Likewise, if they tell you, yeah, you know what, statistics are hard, you're never going to get that, right? That will also influence that. So expectations are really powerful. So the field that applies directly to the workplace in psychology is organizational psychology. So personnel psychology is all about how do we match particular workers to particular tasks, particular types of jobs. Organizational psychology looks at how management styles and work environments influence things like productivity, satisfaction with their job. Um, Industrial organizational psychology looks at the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So we talk about extrinsic motivation as being motivated by rewards and consequences. So the idea here is that you only show up and do well at your job because you know that if you don't, you could lose your job, or because if you don't show up, you're not going to get paid. Right? So these are the extrinsic motivational factors. And then we have intrinsic motivation. And this idea is that the work is sort of inherently satisfying, and achievement in and of itself motivates workers, right? So you do well at your job because you want to do well, because it's satisfying for you to do a good job. That's sort of an intrinsic motivation. So the idea behind Theory X and Theory Y management just states that Theory X managers tend to focus on extrinsic motivation. They tend to see managers as being motivated by external factors. And Theory Y managers tend to focus on intrinsic motivation, and suggest that people are motivated by this sort of internal factors. All right, and so Theory X and Theory Y managers. And again, essentially, Theory X focuses on intrinsic motivation, where Theory Y focuses on, I'm sorry, Theory X focuses on extrinsic, and Theory Y focuses on intrinsic motivation. So last thing to mention is this idea of employee engagement. Engaged workers are more productive than non-engaged workers. And part of what determines worker engagement are the working conditions. And these relate to these ideas of equity theory and distributive justice. So people will work harder and will be more motivated when they feel like their workplace is fair. And the same people are doing the same jobs, are getting the same amount of money. People are getting paid appropriately, and the distribution of resources in the workplace is fair. Procedural justice is that people are also not just concerned with how they get paid in distributions of resources, but they're concerned with this idea of being treated with respect and dignity, feeling like their voice is being heard. So people will work harder and be more motivated when they feel like they're being listened to, right? If you go to your boss and you say, I have this problem and I need this help, and your boss listens to you, you're going to be more engaged at your job than if your boss just sort of ignores you. So that's it for this week. I will go ahead and post next week's video relatively soon. As always, please let me know if you have any questions.